Well, in the first session, we had some very interesting presentations and general discussion on issues such as the local and the global, and support for culture, and the role particularly of government funding, local authority funding in cultural activity. Issues such as what is, broadly discussing what is culture and who is culture for. The distinction that's sometimes raised between culture is what you do versus culture is what you buy a ticket for. And some of the initiatives that have been used, particularly by cities, have focused on this notion of cultural cities, creative cities, which raises all of these factors. And I think we're extremely lucky to have Professor Sacco with us today, not least because of the logistical difficulties he had in terms of getting here, but because the range of his experience in working, well, he's about to experience, the range of experience that he has had in terms of working on a number of cultural bodies, including the Warwick Commission, I was interested to see. And he is going to be talking about socially sustainable models of creativity and cultural-led development. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce Professor Sacco.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My topic this afternoon will be something between culture and creative industry and cultural participation, in particular public participation. Because as I will argue very briefly at the beginning, I think that if you want to have a realistic reasoning about the role of culture in local development models today, we really have to consider much more seriously than we actually do public participation and all the issues connected to this. So I will briefly start with a review of some aspects of the conceptual background that I have been elaborating on and building gradually in the last 2 years, and that will hopefully become a book 1 year from now, which is what I call the Culture 3.0 approach. So very briefly, I will give you now a quick exposition of the main issue. Okay, if we start considering the culture and creative industries, we have to realize that the culture and creative industry, as we know them, have a very short history. In particular, they have been possible only when a certain combination of technological conditions has materialized, and this has basically happened at the beginning of the 20th century. Keep in mind that, at least in my perspective, I don't think that this is a technologically driven change. Social change comes before, and then, of course, technology follows, but certainly only when we materially had the opportunity to profit from recorded music, radio, cinema, of course, photography, it really became possible to have an industry of reproducible contents. But the point is that since the Industrial Revolution proper, and since we are in Scotland, and here it's particularly appropriate to make this remark, but since the Industrial Revolution proper has happened more than 1 century before the actual industrial cultural revolution, this means that throughout the 19th century we have been in a rather awkward position where industry was already booming, but cultural industry was not. This misalignment has created a long-term impact on the European mentality that basically tells us, or better, that has told us for a very long time that industry and culture were odd friends, so to speak. Because our standard visualization of what industrialization really was had nothing to do with culture. And the effects of this, in spite such a long time elapsed so far, are still vivid in our mind. And the other aspect is that, however revolutionary the cultural industrial revolution has been, we are already entering a new revolution that is posing completely different problems, and it's in some sense turning upside down the role and the notion of cultural and creative industry themselves. So what you see here, and I will not elaborate on this in detail, is a sort of periodization of how many different regimes we have seen happening throughout the relationship between cultural production and its social and economic impact. But we can basically divide them into three main regimes, which are Culture 1.0, the cultural patronage in various forms, Culture 2.0, which is the culture and creative industries, and Culture 3.0, which is basically the open communities of practice that are characterizing today the evolution of this particular system. Then, of course, you have a long, very long phase before actual patronage, which historically has been only partially studied. For example, only now we are starting really to understand the economic foundations of Greek classical theater, for example. But what we are learning is that, in some sense, the first full-blown patronage system was the Roman Empire. So, in some sense, that's the moment in which the classical model of Culture 1.0 really takes over. Here, I would like to stress, in particular, 2 points, the 2 key transitions between the 2 regimes. Just making one quick observation. When we speak of patronage, of course, there are different forms of patronage. There is the classical one, there is the strategic one that has been most notably developed in the Italian Renaissance, and there is the public one that basically takes over with the bourgeois revolutions, in particular the French Revolution. But what I want to stress here is the fact that here it's quickly touched, that when you have a public patronage and not an individual patron, you have an urge to decide what kind of art should be supported. And since it's not your personal taste, you're not Lorenzo Magnifico, you are the state, you need gatekeepers, you need experts. So this is where the foundation of the division between high culture and low culture, highbrow, lowbrow, is really established, and this leaves some permanent mark on the social and cultural organization, in some sense, of the cultural field in Europe. In particular, the highbrow stigma of patronage makes, for a very long time in Europe, commercialization of culture something questionable, and basically paves the way to the takeoff of the United States as the powerhouse of cultural and creative industries in the 20th century. Okay? Keep in mind that the first coherent study on the size of cultural and creative industries in Europe has been realized in 2006. So this really means that for Europe there has been a long time to really absorb the shock of the idea that cultural and creative industries could become, in some sense, the main engine from the economic point of view of cultural and creative production. But the point is that we are already entering a new transition. I will not elaborate on cultural and creative industry because we know a lot about that. But what I would like to elaborate about is what's happening now. Now we are seeing the combination of 2 basic streams of technological innovation that in turn reflect corresponding streams of social innovation. And they are basically what we call digital content production plus social media of second generation. Digital content production basically means that everybody today, just really everybody, can produce with little effort semi-professional contents in whatever form. Sound, still image, moving image, text, multimedia. We are already in a situation where you can do this on your, cell phone today, as we know. And the possibilities are expanding at a bewildering pace. At the same time, through second generation social media, we are able really to distribute this content and to target this content exactly to the people that can be interested in that. So this really means that the distinction between producers and users of contents gets blurred. Today, the very idea of still keeping reasoning in terms of audience is basically forcing what's happening. Because audiences, as we have learned to know them for a very long time, do not exist anymore. At least they are a responsive audience. They produce a lot of contents as a consequence, as a natural consequence of the fact that they are exposed to contents. And as we will see, this makes an enormous difference in terms of how can we really reason now in terms of culture-led local development models. In particular, what's the issue? The issue is basically the fact that when we reason in terms of communities of meaning and open platforms, it's not like in the culture and creative industry that we are interested in culture in our spare time. And it's not that we are interested in culture as entertainment. Culture becomes completely ingrained into the fabric of daily life, in every single moment. And in some sense, the whole economy is culturalizing itself to an increasing extent. In particular, this means that we are today starting to understand how this effectively impedes upon health, social cohesion, even environmental sustainability. So just considering the size of culture and creative industry as a sector of the economy is an extremely limited and myopic way to reason about culture, however big the impact, the economic impact can be. It's not the focus of this particular talk, but if I would, for example, have the time to elaborate on the implications on the basis of what we already know of cultural participation on health, I could probably prove you that the size, the macroeconomic effect of a properly understood approach to culture and health in macroeconomic terms could be even bigger than the total turnover in culture and creative industry in Europe. So this is really a completely new kind of game. But the point, which is really the starting point of the core of my presentation, is what happens next. If you think of the big four, the companies that have really, in some sense, monopolized our imaginary of what is today culture and creative industry in different terms, of course, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, they are all, Google, the big four are all, in some respect, at least part of the culture and creative sector. But what is interesting about these models is that however splendid and however powerful they can look, in some sense they are still extending a very conventional logic of 19th century profit maximization companies. There is really very little difference, apart from some aspects in terms of organizational work and so on and so forth, recruiting and so on. But from the point of view of the underlying economic model, these are still very traditional companies. And at the same time, these companies are relying to an increasing extent on the availability of people in a culture 3.0 mentality to produce and share contents in a highly collaborative way and prompted by intrinsic motivation. Are these two things really, in some sense, compatible? The answer is not so much. So, in this moment, of course, we are accelerated by the possibility of having apparently free social media and these fantastically designed pieces of artwork from California and so on and so forth. And so we are still in the euphoria phase. But very quickly, it will become clear that there is a big problem from this point of view of having mainly companies with this kind of structure and this kind of mission that are basically leveraging upon an enormous amount of cognitive surplus that is provided by people basically for free. So this means that if we really want to understand what kind of cultural and creative organizational production, and so culture and creative industry can really emerge in a major phase of the new situation, exactly like, let's say, it took 50 years to really see in the United States what was the cultural industry. It was not, of course, the beginning of Hollywood. It was the major part of Hollywood. We are exactly in the same position now. We are seeing the equivalent of the beginning of Hollywood, the culture 3.0. But this is still heavily affected. But what we already know in terms of culture 2.0 and all the consequences of traditional culture and creative industry. This is the reason why I would like to focus mainly today in understanding how can we renovate practices of bottom-up cultural participation as a premise for a sustainable cultural creative industry. So these two kinds of things that are generally not so well connected. What are the purposes of culture-led development? In general, we expect economic and social growth. And we expect social cohesion and integration of marginalized groups. But let's be frank. What really happens if you do a meta-review of the literature, and I did, is that the really successful experiences in culture-led development are where you don't really need them. So basically, where the conditions are already so favorable, then it works. But the point is that also in these cases, however big the resort to the rhetoric of participation, the narratives generally are dictated by the main stakeholders and not by the real small constituencies. In particular, can we really reason in terms of cultural public participation for real, or is just a rhetoric? What we really need to have a social negotiation going on is, of course, to create real social capital through culture, which is easier, in some sense, more easily said than done. Making really space for the weaker constituencies, and now we see what's the problem with this. And, of course, just pulling out the intrinsic motivation of people about the social value of culture, which, however, it's very difficult since we insist so much on the economic impact of culture, also from the policy point of view, or the policy-making point of view. When it comes to the real argument, what you put on the table is, yes, but the turnover of culture and creative industries, whatever. So what really counts from this point of view is the instrumental reasoning rather than the intrinsic one, also because we are still not good enough in conceptualizing and measuring the intrinsic impact. Cultural public participation suffers from a serious adverse selection effect. What do I mean by this? Very simply, if you really want to participate, you have to have the skills to participate. So you have to be able to manage a public debate. You have to be able to defend and anticipate possible objections to your line of reasoning and an argument. Who is able to do this? Of course, the most educated people, of course, the better off people in terms of resources. So this basically means that the people that really participate, which are the people that really establish bonds with the local context, are the people who are, again, more educated, and they are really able to argue their own motivation for participating, and especially in some sense to represent themselves as participators. The worst of people are generally less inclined to participate. What we have seen is that apart from a very specific cases, it's very difficult to have really marginalized people to participate culturally because they don't think they belong and they don't think they can really play a role in this kind of processes, and very often they are even scared by the consequences in embarking in a process that they cannot really understand in the first place in terms of purposes and motivation. The creative class. I will not insist enough on how badly this has impacted on the practices of cultural participation. The very idea of dividing the society into a creative and an uncreative class has created a total conundrum. And especially the fact that the success of Richard Florida has basically been one of focusing on the point of view of the so-called creative people as they are defined, as if this is the only real narrative that matters, the only narratives that really make a difference for culture. All the other narratives are just in the way. They are just to be taken away. And at the same time, of course, this has become an extremely good argument for advocates of gentrification. And I don't have to tell you in detail how this happens, because you see it happening all the time. And in particular, of course, as a consequence of this, culture has become more and more instrumental, because if the argument is you have to pay the way for creatives because creatives create development, again, it's a totally instrumental argument. But it's the other way around. And the other way around means that, first of all, there is no real creative class divide. But why? Think of Culture 3.0. Because today everybody produces contents. And it's not an issue of gatekeepers that can say, okay, you're good, you're bad. People naturally are into it. So reasoning in terms of a class divide apart that from the sociological point of view, it's a complete nonsense, because the concept of class has nothing to do with Florida conceptualization. What is really interesting is that there is really no reason to frame the problem in these terms. What's really important now is not just to classify who's creative and who's not. The problem is empowering people, all kinds of people, to participate in the process in their own way. And this means that the real urgency has to do exactly with the people that are not engaged, the people that we generally classify as not creative, that really can become, from this point of view, the element that makes this process more socially sustainable and more equitable. And, in particular, this changes the role of creative professionals, because in this kind of context, the creative professionals are not simply representatives of a specific sector, but can really become agents of social change if they accept their new role in this situation, which has to do with interacting with people that are generally not engaged in a different way. Public participation, alas, is also about conflict. And we have to deal with this. It's not that we just use cheesy rhetorics to remove the fact that there is conflict. There is conflict, yes. And in particular, this means governance. And this means that, again, it's easy to use the rhetorics of participation, as we said, to mask, in some sense, a decision-making process that has already happened. So what we really need is to have a different approach to culture-led development, where we can really question and redesign the decision-making process that is behind participation, that is behind a certain model of culture-led development, and even that is behind a certain strategy for culture and creative industry development in a specific territory. And it's mainly about trust building. The real problem is building trust with that part of the society that thinks they are excluded from this. Think of what's happening in London, and you will see a textbook illustration of the contradiction of this kind of situation. And so, wiring the community for change. What does this mean? We have an extremely interesting ally in developing this process. And this is, in some sense, social storytelling, but not social storytelling as it is used today in, let's say, creative advertising. It's a social storytelling as a social ability. Because what is interesting about storytelling is that it's really a universal language, and everybody, every human, single human being, has been culturally developing an ability for stories. If there is something that universally attracts us, is stories, and the reason is that we are starting to understand today that stories are a way to learn from experiences that we never made. Basically, just answer to this simple question: why should we be interested in the fate of a character that we know historically has never existed, but still really makes us feel? The reason is that we identify so much with the existential problem posed by that character that for us becomes a real matter. Well, this is not incidental. This is a socially ingrained ability, and everybody has it. So the point is that if we really want to refound a basic model of bottom-up participation, we can really build on the collective ability to construct stories, to discuss stories, to elaborate stories, and in particular, we can really qualify culture and cultural production as a platform for what I call autocatalytic social storytelling. So a situation where everybody is entitled to contribute in ways that of course have to be collectively designed by trial and error to this new kind of process. Exactly the contrary of the philosophy of the creatives and the audience that claps the hands. In particular, what can community storytelling do? What you see in the literature is extremely interesting. In collective storytelling, you can design processes of alternative scenario projection analysis and deliberation. You can take on extremely difficult issues of social bargaining over different positions on a certain situation, because storytelling, by the way, has an extremely interesting property. If you just keep in mind what is the traditional structure of storytelling, the one that everybody has in mind, let's say from fairy tales, is that there is an extremely strong focus towards pro-social orientations. So the interesting aspect about storytelling is that it teaches people that pro-social orientations in certain circumstances are not only feasible, but they are the only way to get through certain situations. So focusing on the analysis of certain problems through social storytelling makes an extremely powerful behavioral filter in terms of taking responsibility for the social good. We have experiences with inclusive planning design, collective action, and more generally a polyphonic approach, rather than this master vision that more or less it's just superimposed on the situation. And this has to do also, by the way, with what we are learning today about the basic structure of plots. This is, for example, a quick resume of the thesis of Christopher Booker, distinguished, very well-known English writer that a few years ago published this monumental work on analyzing how 7 basic scripts, basic plots, are responsible for the understanding that we have of most of storytelling, an analysis that has resisted, in some sense, to the check of time, and I find still very valid. I don't have the time to elaborate on this, but this really means that we can really build a canvas, in some sense, of social storytelling formats in very different situations, and in particular, how this storytelling can be implemented into a culture 3.0 perspective. So the first element was social storytelling, but the second element is what we could call community informatics and civic hacking. So it's really about bringing in all the possibilities that we are already exploiting with digital platforms to really redesign our own world, starting from specific bottom-up projects. For example, this is a very interesting project of civic hacking that has to do with transforming all payphone appliances into basically social libraries in ways that have to do with a very strong signal to the local community that this community is transforming space to become a learning community. And this has to do with the real issue that I personally think is the number one in the priorities, that is a massive capability building. So the capacity really to elicit in every single constituent of society a minded investment in building the capabilities for active citizenship and active participation in this kind of processes. Just to use a simple metaphor, and in 2 minutes I'm going to conclude. But just to use a simple metaphor, we cannot have, for example, an economy that wants to thrive in cooking if people don't have the basic abilities to eat. And this is exactly the same thing. If we really want to work in a knowledge society, a proper knowledge society, we really need a bottom-up, strong investment in the capabilities that are needed to make every person feel entitled as an active citizen to be part of this community. And the third element from this point of view is what we could call relational public art. What's happening today in the public art practices, it is less and less about placing sculptures in the public space, and it's more and more about interacting with local communities through processes in long-term commitment. What you see here, for example, in this illustration is an extremely touching example. It happens in Catania, in Sicily, in an extremely deprived situation, which is one of the worst neighborhoods of the whole Sicily, with extremely low levels of human development, basically one of the lowest in Europe. And at the same time, this fantastic work being made by local public artists, building together a sort of wall of beauty, together with the local population as co-creators of the wall. So we are not really interested in the fact that the wall looks like a Damien-Hirst or not. We are much more interested in knowing how this has modified the structural social relations there. And the fact that this has become for them an asset they not only defend as an artwork, but as an expression of the community. In some sense, it's part of the social contract, the new social contract of this community. And this is an artistic public art project. And of course, this means that if you start processes like this and if you convince artists that this can really be an exciting new field for research, much more often, in some cases, than just producing for an extremely small number of collectors just to, in some sense, to outsmart them in this kind of baroque court game that is becoming most of contemporary art, and I sadly say this as an advocate of contemporary art. This is, from this point of view, is a really exciting perspective that artists can explore. So basically, if we have to just summarize some of the aspects, it's first of all, stop reasoning in terms of audience development as the support for culture and creative industry, and start thinking in terms of cultural citizenship and collective sense-making. Second point, the digital is not only a powerful platform for industrial production of contents, but it's a platform for civic hacking and capability building. Not civic aching, sorry. Public space is a co-creation space, it's not just a stage. These three elements, social storytelling, community informatics, and relational art projects, can really define together a new approach to public cultural participation. This entails trial and error, and of course fosters a much stronger demand for accountability from the local community. There is just one small example that we have developed in Siena during the bid for the European Culture Capital 2019, called Bookupy Siena, in which we take a place like Siena, so which an enormous local identity in terms of tradition, history, and so on, and we have basically created a public civic hacking platform in terms of rewriting through Twitter the cultural and creative identity of the city by impersonating all the main characters, artworks, and basically playing with the interaction between the digital space and the physical space. So what was happening in the digital space was taken into the physical space in terms of strips of printed tweets, and having, for example, elderly people interacting with them, using this as a platform for them to participate in the collective storytelling. And this has been, of course, a small experiment, but it was an extremely minimal budget, and it was extremely successful. So, for example, it was for us truly inspiring to the real possibilities of this method if it is taken seriously. And to conclude, so, a few things. Culture 3.0, however novel it may sound, is itself a transitional model. It's not what will gonna happen in the next 20 years. What we have in front of us is a situation that will change beyond our current understanding, even, I think, of the analysts of the Big Four. And in all transitions, what we take today as familiar will most likely disappear. Exactly like people trying to understand the cinema from their understanding of theater, how biased it was. Second point, imitating the business leaders of today in terms of creative industry is really lagging behind, because what's happening has to do with radical social change. Third point, the real disruptive innovation is in community participation. The disruptive innovation is not in technology, not because technology is not important. I'm personally working a lot, for example, on wearable technologies and so on and so forth. But the point is the social software that is behind. So how we really involve the communities in these kind of things. And if you really want to build a long-term culture-led development model, participation is the priority. This is the asset, not technology in itself. So technology is extremely important, and especially for cultural policies, we really have to understand that what's not happening, for example, in the United States, where we still have a very industrial culture 2.0 approach to what is happening. In Europe, we can really make the difference if we remember from where we come and what we have learned in the process. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you very much for a very stimulating discussion about how we should think of cultural development and participation, and the importance of participation in terms of building communities. Can we open it up for questions? Yes, there's a question here. I don't know if someone has the mic.
studying. That was very interesting. For example, community storytelling and public art and bukupi. But how to measure the effectiveness of these art events or art itself? That was my first question. And then I do agree that a lot of not only business people but also funding bodies are very myopic. So they want immediate result or immediate outcome. But then given that the art has such a long-term and indirect effect to society, how to justify your value to society for something that is somehow very far away?
Thank you very much. Two very precise questions. First of all, there is today a strong development of new approaches to measuring the apparently intangible crossover aspects of cultural activity and participation. At the European level, for example, there is a new project launched by the Joint Research Center that is of the European Commission that is only targeting this. What I can say, also because I'm personally involved in much of this research, for example, in the relationship between culture and health or culture and sustainability, is that today we have tools. We have tools that give very clear statistical evidence. For example, you can relatively easily measure the effect of cultural participation on health if you use the right clinical indicators. And there is a lot of literature on this. For example, with my group, I am using a lot what is called psychological general well-being. There is a very stable clinical measure of well-being that has been used in clinical practice for over 20 years. And for example, on this basis, it's been possible to demonstrate that the effects are really, really huge. Just to give you an idea, since there is a relationship between psychological general well-being and the susceptibility of people to hospitalization and medicalization, for example, we are now studying a tentative evaluation of how, let's say, an increase of active cultural participation in the 70-plus elderly is changing psychological general well-being and hospitalization rates. We have an extremely prudent estimate that this could cut, let's say, almost instantly by 5% the hospitalization rate. If you think of Europe as an aging continent, and how does it mean? What does it mean? 5% less expenses in the 70-plus cohort. In terms of hospitalization, you already see that the macroeconomic effect is likely to match the culture and creative industry turnover. So these are the new perspectives. And the other one, for example, we had just published our research with my research group. I think is the first ever in which we show that on the census data from the Italian census, we are able to demonstrate that in terms of efficiency of waste recycling, when the recycled bin is more than 500 meters from home, the variable that really makes the difference in terms of the willingness of people to go all the way and to put the garbage in the recycled bin is cultural participation. It's not education, it's not income, it's not age, it's cultural participation, which, for example, opens up a completely new field in terms of how culture and sustainability are related. As to the second point, you really hit the issue. And the issue is decision makers. I can tell you that personally, my experience has been profoundly affected by a collaboration that they have started a few years ago with Sweden. Because what happened when I started working, for example, on cultural planning in Sweden, is that I found immediately Swedish policymakers and politicians willing to spend time to understand what we were going to do. So basically, for example, we have started a very, very interesting collaboration with Skaraborg, which is a province just out of Gothenburg. And when we started this collaboration, a whole delegation of politicians came from Skaraborg. We had 2 days of seminar in Milan. We extensively reviewed the techniques, the purposes, and so on. And then we started the project. At this point, these people are knowledgeable. They know what we are going to do. So the real problem is that, of course, there is a political payoff to go for short term. But this is badly worsened by the fact that these politicians don't really understand what's going on. So they vaguely understand that there is something about culture. They vaguely understand that this could matter, but it's not very popular on the media, on the normal political games. So as soon as there is a difficulty, they kill the project, which is basically what has happened to me 90% of the time in Italy. So where exactly the opposite attitude holds, where politicians think they are not important enough if they spend more than 5 minutes listening to them. So the real problem is really this. If we really have, in some sense, to create the conditions for politicians to be trained in decision making. I understand that this is extremely difficult, but since I've seen this happening, and not incidentally, Sweden today is the country #1 in Europe of cultural participation and innovation, which again is very related, I think that this is a very worthwhile effort.
Thanks. Robin Person, Institute of Industries at M&A University. Thank you for, as ever, an extremely interesting and incisive presentation, Professor Sacco. I just wanted to ask you whether or not you felt there was a danger of a perverse consequence in what has become, certainly in the UK, to be known as a cultural value debate. There's an awful lot of work being done on measuring cultural value. And the danger is this, that there's a danger or a risk of a new form of instrumentalism, which is the social health and indirect economic benefits of social health inclusiveness in, as it were, participation in culture and arts, which then creates if you like, a policy framework in which the kinds of cultural activity that maximize these social health and other benefits are seen to be of more value than other forms of cultural or arts investment, which are, or arts funding, which don't produce these immediate social and tangible benefits. There is, I think, a risk there that policymakers and politicians start to weigh cultural support and investment on those new instrumental grounds, and we lose the intrinsic, the risky, difficult to define benefits of art that can't be weighed in that form when it's first created. Would you agree or not? Or
well, that's again a very interesting question. By the way, I've marginally been involved in the work of the Commission on Cultural Value. It was logistically very difficult for me to really take part in I just came once. But at the same time, yes, I felt the same issue. There is a big issue because I've seen, for example, that the artistic community in the UK has not entirely welcomed this kind of study. There is a lot of concern already raised during the elaboration. And I understand why. Because in the end, it could really be a sort of sector advocacy, so to speak, that basically makes a very intelligent lobbying, but this is basically what it risks to become. I think that the problem is not in the study itself, but in how it is received by politicians. Because in this moment, for example, in some countries, not only in the UK, some countries that in Europe are taking very seriously cultural and creative industry are also at the same time implicitly legitimizing cultural and creative industry only insofar as it yields certain economic results. For example, what's happening in the Netherlands in terms of cutting the budget for traditional non-industrial activities like performing arts or visual arts or heritage is highly telling of the risk that is behind this. So the real problem from this point of view is not in the study itself, because I think it's a valuable piece of work for what it is, but of course it should be supplemented by a comparable advocacy, in some sense on the aspects that I have just tried to point out today. The fact that in the end, even if you argue that there is a considerable production of cultural value in the literal terms of economic impact, but at the same time you lose sight of what is the real constituency behind culture, you simply don't understand the process. You understand only one aspect of the process, and this is extremely misleading in terms of the long-term result, and especially the sustainability of this kind of thing. Which, by the way, is one of the critical aspects of why today the United States are losing competitiveness in this particular sector. Just a last very quick note. Now, in this moment, I am studying very closely what's happening in the Far East, because especially in certain countries in the Far East, primarily South Korea, we are seeing completely different models emerging from this point of view, and you really see the difference here. And even in a place like South Korea, for example, where, the impact on the local economy is tremendous, and they have created almost from scratch a booming global industry of cultural and creative contents, you see at the same time an extremely profound relationship between this and traditional identity. In this moment, just to give you an idea, I am writing a book on Korean TV dramas, really to, in some sense, to unfold the narrative that is behind and how deeply entrenched this is, for example, in renegotiating the identity of the country in terms of traditional knowledge, the Taoism, Confucianism basis, and how this relates, for example, to the American influence models. And this is the kind of issue that in Europe we are losing. This fact that we have an increasingly able number of lobbyists in Brussels that lobby for the cultural and creative industry, but in a very American way, I see this as a highly dangerous kind of thing. And in this sense, you're right, this kind of evidence, if used that way, could become detrimental in a sense.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Thomas Wall. I'm looking for a bit of help, please, if you can think of a model that I can use in an argument for a local issue that we're facing just now. In the public schools in West Lothian, for a long time, there have been music teachers who provided instrumental music tuition to school pupils who are motivated to want to learn a music instrument. Now, because of reductions in public funding, the local authority, the education authority, is saying we're going to cut back these music teachers. The proposal has been made, can't we share the cost? Perhaps the students can pay a fee equal to half the cost of the lesson and the government pays the other half, or something like that. And the answer from the politicians is no. Education must be free, and if we do not have enough money to pay 100% of the cost, there will be no music teachers. We will stop it completely. And that seems to me to be completely absurd. Do you have any examples, perhaps from other countries, who've managed this issue rather better?
I mean, the reasoning is quite peculiar, because, we already have today an extremely well-documented record of evidence that music training is so beneficial for young people in a variety of different respects. For example, in terms of a deviant behavior in early teenagers, for example, even in socially risky situations. I mean, it's such a huge evidence. And also in terms of vocational orientation, the fact that you learn to play an instrument does not make of you a professional musician, but makes of you someone who knows much better how to manage the capability building process. So from this point of view, the idea of erasing this just because of an abstract principle really sounds to me completely nonsense. On the other hand, in terms of examples, I haven't seen recently, at least, examples where this kind of dilemma was solved in a useful way for how you formulated the problem, because, this attitude towards education and public funding that you are raising is, in some sense, very peculiar of the UK in this moment. So, for example, in Italy, the problem is not existing. They have just completely erased music education, but nobody really complains. There are places where this is historically rooted. Think of Baltic countries that, they are prioritizing this to such a level that they would probably cut the budget of defense rather than cutting the budget of music education. So the point is that it's really linked, I think, to some local cultural conditions. So there is not an easy answer, but I think that it's worthwhile to fight for the right of people to, in some sense, to maintain this kind of activity, because in terms of the documented impact that it has, and in terms of, having the local decision makers take responsibility in the face of the real impact, that could be, I think, a strong argument, because the point is that for most of the public opinion and for most, not the totality of politicians, is more like, okay, these people want to play because it's their taste, because they want to be entertained better. But that's not absolutely the issue. This has to do with education in the deepest sense. But the problem is that in the public debate, this does not come out. So this is the point, to really, in some sense, unfold the implications of these decisions at a level that most decision makers and even the public opinion don't understand.
A question here?
Right. very, very interesting hearing your work. I noticed that you used the word capabilities in there, and is the use of this language influenced by the work of, say, Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen?
Of course.
Right. And thinking about the grassroots, for example, in Edinburgh. You can throw a tennis ball before it bounces 3 times. You've got some really competent musicians.
Yes.
And I've been taking stories from them and asking, well, where are your opportunities? What opportunities do you want? And overwhelmingly, I'm hearing that there's a problem of scale. The small individual creative, much as the tools have radically democratized production, their ability to share their work through the corporate governance systems and distribution networks seem to be almost zero. And I'm wondering, how do we build capabilities in a corporate world?
That's the issue. And in some sense, it's a corporate world, but it's evolving into a very complex kind of corporate world where the corporate that we have in mind is going to be transformed very deeply for the reasons that I just pointed out before. The point is that, there are examples, and Edinburgh, by the way, in my opinion, is one notable example in this respect. There are examples of cities that really go on the right track. In many respects, if I can think of a city in Europe that has coherently made of culture one asset in some sense for urban transformation, well, Edinburgh is very, very high on the list. But the point is, what happens next? The real issue is when things really get serious, and you really have to understand if among the real top priorities, culture is there or not. What happens? So, for example, I have just participated to the meeting in Riga for the Latvian semester of the European Commission. And there was this big conference on cultural crossovers where with ministers, with the new governance of the DG Culture in Brussels, there was this reflection about how is culture making a difference in the 2014-2020 strategic perspective. And in that case, I try to be tough and say it's not really making a difference because culture, you don't see it in the real top levels of the European planning, for example, in terms of the thematic objectives of the cohesion policy, in terms of the flagship projects of the European smart specialization strategy, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, this has sparked a debate, and I'm really curious to see what happens because now EU 2020 strategy is going to be revised. But the point is this. Okay, we have very nice examples that work in Edinburgh, in other cities. But when it really comes to the serious level of really prioritizing culture among the 3-4 different things that really made a difference, is culture there? The answer is no. It's never there. So the real problem is making this last step, especially in places that have already made significant advances in this respect. What we really need is to have experiments where culture really becomes one of the key issues as the environment, as education, as innovation, and these examples are still waiting for us in some sense. They are not there yet. And I just conclude with an example that is interesting for this point of view, because if you don't do it, in a sense, you could even fall victim of your own success. For example, in these days in Austin, there is South by Southwest, that is becoming one of the most important festivals in the world. It started as a normal music festival, it's becoming the festival of everything. With an enormous turnover, only in the last year, $100 million of extra turnover from one edition to the other. But the consequence of this is that in this moment, the success of Austin as an attractive hub for culture and creative innovation and technology is so strong that it's projected that in 1 year time, the population will pass from 700,000 to 2 million. So it's impossible to manage. But by the way, this has also happened because unlike the Silicon Valley, so far Austin has really managed a policy of equitable social distribution of the returns of this development model. So the issue is, if you, in this kind of dramatic situation, even when you are so successful, if culture does not really become one of the 3-4 key issues, in some sense, your success becomes the main threat. Because you cannot really govern these processes. You cannot really make them, in some sense, work in a proper, sustainable sense. So the real issue that I see here in this moment in Europe is finding a few places that in this cycle, 2014-2020 of planning, we can really have some local examples where culture is taken so seriously that is really prioritized in the agenda. Let's see what happens. Because if we don't give culture this chance, we will never be able to prove politicians what culture can do for Europe, for example, from 2020 onwards. And this is not true only for Europe, but as I said, even more in some cases for non-European countries and cities.
I was just wondering, sorry, I'm going to take a chair's prerogative at the end, because we've come to the end,
Sure.
Maybe slightly provocatively. I was just wondering the extent to which some of the political issues that are seen in terms of the threat of ISIS, for example, and the very strong role that cultural production in ISIS and radical politicization might not actually give you, perversely, the incentive to support cultural programs in Europe.
This is an extremely interesting issue. By the way, the next semester of presidency will be Luxembourg, and the theme of Luxembourg will be culture in less developed areas of the world. So it's a very interesting thing. For the first time, Europe is putting this kind of issue on the agenda. The ISIS issue is particularly interesting because in this moment I'm making a very interesting experience of collaborating with a group of researchers from UCLA that made an archaeology excavation camp in Syria. And of course now they have been forced to abandon this. But interestingly, the work that they have done in terms of capability building with the local population has been so huge and so targeted that now the local population is not simply protecting the excavations, but they are organizing exhibitions about this. So they are really taking this as a platform for, in some sense, not simply passive resistance, but active proposal. And so this is why, with this group of colleagues, we are starting to reason about a possible manifesto for responsible archaeology, for example. That becomes, especially in this so-called underdeveloped context, an issue of, let's say, turning what is the post-colonialist attitude of Europeans. We are the learned people, we just excavate, you are the barbarians, and it's already fantastic if you don't destroy it. But this is the consequence of this. It's the consequence because in some sense it's already part of the narrative. But if you really turn this upside down, and you enable these people, you create the capability base, I mean, the reaction is fantastic. So I think that this is a key issue for the future.
On that note, I'd like to thank Professor Sacco very much indeed.
Thank you very much.